I'm Sophie Coe, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we look at why and how imposters posing as Ukrainian politicians have managed to prank call British MPs, and discuss how the geopolitical tensions have played out in sporting arenas across the globe.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, I sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's day 23, and today I'm joined by Dom Nichols, the Telegraph's Defence and Security Editor, and Danielle Sheridan, our Defence and Political Correspondent. Let's start with you, Dom. Can you tell us more about the airstrikes moving west in the last 24 hours?
Yeah, hi Sophie, hi everybody. So overnight there were more airstrikes to the west of the country. An area largely untouched so far in the war. It's taken a few hits, but the tempo of strikes in and around Lviv and the west part of Ukraine seems to be increasing. There were some strikes last night to the southwest of the city of Lviv at the civilian airfield, and also destroyed an airplane manufacturing facility. Whether or not that was the actual target or if it was just sort of random shelling as we've seen elsewhere in the country, we don't know. But it does look like the tempo of attacks towards the west of the country is increasing. Of course, that's where the supply routes are from the Western supplies. And it was only yesterday that the US announced an $800 million package of extra arms to Ukraine, and Britain said that we were going to be sending Sky Sabre to Poland, a medium-range air defence system, and Star Streak missiles, short-range air defence, man-portable air defence, into Ukraine. Elsewhere, Mariupol still under siege, and horrific scenes from there. A small number of civilians are able to get out, but it is desperate there. The World Food Programme have said that their supply chains across the country are falling apart. That's their description, and cite Mariupol as an area of particular concern. It's just that the whole civil infrastructure is collapsing, particularly in Mariupol. Absolutely desperate for people there. There's a couple of other points just worth noting. Bulgaria expelled 10 Russian diplomats yesterday for quote, activities incompatible with their diplomatic status, which I think we can sort of read as spying. So this ties in with what we've said before about there'll be a great effort from Russia to try and find where these supply lines are coming from other NATO countries, but other countries who may not be in NATO, supplying weapons and aid and humanitarian aid and what have you into Ukraine. And of course, the problem is that these things aren't going to be marked. How once they get into Ukraine and they are targetable for striking, then what's the difference between a van carrying weapons and a van carrying humanitarian aid? It's going to be very difficult to tell that. So the more there's this activity towards the west, the greater likelihood there is of more civilian casualties in that area.
Thanks, Dom. That was obviously a lot of information, and it seems like there is a lot of kind of diplomatic and tactical updates all kind of happening at the same time this morning. I know we're speaking at the moment that talks are supposed to commence between Biden and Xi Jinping this morning. What do you think the role of China could be from here on in, and actually what the outcome of these talks could be?
So China's really interesting. We've said for days, weeks now, that China has a pivotal part to play here. And if China seeks to step up for a global leadership role, which the country should do, a P5 member of the UN, nuclear power, a great world power, then China should seek to hold such a position. But obviously with great power comes great responsibility, as says the old phrase. So it's very interesting that Biden, we're told, is going to be impressing upon the Chinese leader not to get involved and not to support Russia with economic aid or military aid. Of course, that is, I hope China don't do that, but they're entirely able to. It's perfectly legitimate for them to choose to do that should they so wish. We have chosen to do the same for Ukraine. So there's nothing intrinsically wrong for China to choose to do that. It would, of course, nail their colours to the mast and say which side of this argument they are falling down on. So that would be very interesting to see the signs that come out of that later. But two other signs that China might be starting to try and put a bit more distance between themselves and Russia. Chinese state media yesterday put out video footage of the attack a few days ago in Chernihiv, where 10 civilians were killed. Initial reports said that they were shot by Russians. I think now that's been largely disputed, and we think it was an artillery strike. But 10 civilians were killed in a bread queue in Chernihiv. China's state media had not been putting out images of those sort of civilian casualties and not really covering much of the war from the Ukraine or the civilian side before. So the fact that they do this, and they don't have a huge amount of autonomy, so the fact that they've been able to do this, it just suggests that China are growing increasingly unhappy with the course of the war and the number of civilian casualties. And the second thing is that yesterday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov flew from Moscow, or was flying from Moscow to Beijing for talks, we think, to discuss economic and military aid. And his flight turned around mid-flight. So why was that? Was this a diplomatic snub from China saying, actually, you're not welcome? Of course, they wouldn't say that. They'd say, direct clash, President Xi or the foreign minister is not available, or for whatever reason. Or was there something at home? There's all these talk of this blame game going around the Russian security apparatus at the moment, talk of sort of moles and coups and all the rest of it. So was Lavrov called home? We don't know, but I mean, it is extremely unusual to have a foreign minister in the air, literally in the air, and have the plane turn around and go back home. So there are just some tentative signs that China is just putting a little bit of distance between the position Beijing has and its sort of tacit support up to now for Russia's position.
Thanks, Dom. And just going quickly back to the first update you gave us today about the attacks in Lviv. Now, obviously, we're coming much closer to the NATO border with the city of Lviv. It's obviously on the Polish side of Ukraine. Do you think this is a new kind of offensive for Russia, or was it a one-off attack on the airbase, or could this actually change the kind of direction and scale of Russia's invasion?
I don't know if it'll change the direction, because they simply haven't got the ground force to be able to back anything up. They can destroy from the air, as we've seen elsewhere, but that in and of itself doesn't really achieve much. You're not taking and holding ground. You're not in a position of great political advantage there, unless you lay waste to huge swathes of the countryside, which we are seeing in the east and the south. So striking to the west like this is not a significant development in the war. It almost smacks of desperation that Russia are having to use these strikes. There's reports that they are very low, if not out of precision-guided munitions at the moment. The fact it's so close to NATO's borders is a concern. That is why Britain is sending its Sky Sabre radars to Poland. And I was told yesterday when I interviewed James Heappey, the Minister for the Armed Forces, he said that actually Sky Sabre's perfect, because if you put a system like the US Patriot system there that's very long range, that will be able to stare into mainland Russia and could be seen as a threat. Rightly so. I mean, these are military weapons. Of course they're a threat. But having a shorter range, I mean, Sky Sabre is medium range air defence system. That signals that it is very much more defensive rather than offensive. So that was NATO's response, Britain's response to this increased focus on the West from Russia, just to say, be very, very careful about throwing heavy metal through the sky. There's a border there, and the more you do it, the more chance there is of miscalculation, an escalation by accident. So not a huge direction for Russia. It doesn't really mean anything other than that's all they can do, but it is nonetheless worrying.
Thanks, Dom. Before we kind of move on from this first update section, I do want to say that you can listen back to Dom's interview with the Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey, on yesterday's Ukraine the Latest podcast, which you can find on all your podcast apps. I wanted to bring in Danny here, our political and defence correspondent. Now, I know that you've been looking into the story that emerged yesterday and that's on the front pages of our paper this morning, that Russians have targeted Priti Patel and Ben Wallace with fake video calls. I wonder if you could tell me more about the story.
Yeah, I mean, it's concerning that such a sophisticated ploy could have taken place and targeted 2 cabinet ministers. So they were separate occasions, but starting with Ben Wallace, he was sent an invitation from another governmental department inviting him to have a chat with someone that claimed to be the Ukrainian Prime Minister. And Ben Wallace was engaged in a conversation with this person over Teams video link for nearly 10 minutes before becoming spooked by some of the questions he was asking and terminating the phone call. It does raise questions as to how such a situation occurred. How did this email rise the ranks all the way to top government? There is an inquiry that's been launched. Ben Wallace is said to be very unhappy with the fact that this was able to happen in the first place. As part of this investigation, no doubt government will really be looking at the security procedures that has in place regarding organising such conversations. I mean, it sounds like nothing serious, no big state secrets are given away. I spoke to the Defence Secretary about it last night for our story, and he said he played it pretty straight throughout the conversation. But that is the worry, that a person could be enticed into giving away very sensitive information. On the flip side, what it also shows, which is something that Ben Wallace has said himself, is that Russia is becoming more desperate. You know, this war isn't going in the way it had planned. It expected the Ukrainians to capitulate, and they haven't yet, and hopefully won't. And therefore, they're having to deploy other arsenals, such as misinformation. It hasn't been confirmed that it was the Russians behind this, but one can assume it was. And the Russians are known for this kind of like grey misinformation area as a tactic. So, you know, it plays into the Russian playbook. And I don't know if we can expect more of this, but the fact that Priti Patel was also targeted shows that it is something that they are looking to do, and see it as a useful means to eke out information. Fortunately, they weren't able, as we understand, as things currently stand, they weren't able to get any sensitive information out of these ministers. But I suppose it's just going to put everyone on guard now. And as I said, they'll no doubt be stepping up security when it comes to setting up conversations online. When you have, I was about to say when you have no way of verifying, but I suppose, you know, this person was a different individual sat on camera, and it was questioning that led, after 10 minutes, the phone call to be terminated. No one said, hang on a second, this guy doesn't, that's not him. They look different. I mean, so I suppose that's something as well that needs to be really looked at. How was it possible for a conversation to take place for 10 minutes without someone realising that they were talking to someone that wasn't who they purported to be?
I guess my next question would be, in what medium did this call kind of play out? Because I guess as someone who works remotely, you'd think that they would have kind of a different set of technology and government for making these kind of high security calls. But is that a sense that you get?
It happened on Teams, a video call. The Defence Secretary wouldn't have been the only person on that call. Other people would have been there. So other people would have been watching the footage live. The imposter was sat with a Ukrainian flag behind him, apparently. But they also, I mean, it was sophisticated in the sense that the initial email setting up the conversation was sent from someone within the Ukrainian government, like an email address linked to an individual. So in terms of, you know, verifying it, I can see from a face level why it might have looked convincing. But it goes back to my point of, no doubt, as part of this inquiry into how this happened, they'll be looking at making sure their systems are more robust, particularly as these are the kind of dirty tricks that Russia's renowned for playing. So we should surely be on our guard anyway that they're capable of these sort of hoax. I mean, we mentioned it in our story today, but Prince Harry was hoaxed into thinking he was talking to Greta Thunberg once before, and ended up saying some controversial things that he probably shouldn't have said. So, and that was a Russian imposter. So we should be aware that this is the kind of thing that they will be doing, and therefore be on guard that we are susceptible to these sort of attacks. And I suppose, I mean, I'm no security expert, but they'll be considering the kind of things that they discuss online going forward, like how sensitive should these conversations actually only be happening face to face as opposed to online, which is a medium that can be very easily hacked, regardless to having an imposter there. I mean, who knows who's listening in and taking note. So I mean, I'm sure that high-level conversations don't even take place online in that way anyway. I'm sure they are more face-to-face.
Thanks, Danny. I guess my final question, which I don't know if, Dom, you'd want to come in on this as well, is how worried should we be? Is there a chance that more ministers were targeted and actually we're not hearing about it? Is this only coming out because Ben Wallace tweeted about it? Could it be a wider issue that's already spiralling, or actually do you think that this inquiry will happen, it will get wrapped up and the risks will kind of decrease?
Well, Priti Patel came forward, was forthcoming to say, this also happened to me. No other ministers did that. It is embarrassing, I suppose, to admit it. So perhaps this has happened at other levels and people have declined to share that information because they don't want to admit that they were tricked. Or it has only happened to. Also, it's happened and people aren't aware that they've been tricked. So I suppose that's kind of speculation. I'm interested to know what Dom thinks on it.
Yeah, so Western officials were saying this morning that this is a known threat. Of course it is, and they said that since in the build up to this war, they've been increasing their advice to prominent people who might be attacked, which is only right and proper. I think we can take some sort of solace from this about how it happened. I mean, it's embarrassing, of course it is for Ben Wallace and what have you. But I mean, he's a big boy; he can handle it, and he's got his defence in early. He said that, and as they will, they'll splice and dice this, and they'll put something hilarious out with him saying some stupid stuff. He's already kind of got that defence out there, and he said, look, they're not going to show the bit when I was talking about the need for a free press and how Russia's war is stuttering and all the rest of it. So of course they're not going to put that bit out. And of course yesterday we also had President Zelensky, the deep fake of President Zelensky. So yeah, Wallace is in good company. You can say this is happening to all of us. We're being hacked. It's almost a badge of honour that they feel they should attack somebody so prominent. And of course, it's worth bearing in mind what the kind of Russian ecosystem of cyber espionage looks like. I mean, you've got the Russian state at the centre with some amazing high-end capabilities, the same as we have in Britain and the US and other countries around the world. But I mean, they are very sophisticated and capable of a very dangerous and impactful hacks. And then there's this sort of ecosystem of willing, compliant groups who are tacitly supported by Moscow. They might get a little bit of money. They might get a little bit of political cover. They are tolerated as long as their attacks land outside the borders of Russia. That seems to be the deal. That you don't try and ransom anyone or make any money from inside Russia and have a go at the political establishment there. But anything overseas is fair game. So there's this entire ecosystem. And the further you get to the edges of that, the more you get towards the sort of gifted amateurs and all the rest of it. So I think when you've actually got somebody on a fake call hoaxing Ben Wallace, I mean, that's probably quite far out to the edge, because if he'd been hacked by the Russian state, then they wouldn't tell him they were there. They'd just lay implants on his phone. They'd just be hoovering up the data, listening to it, looking at keyloggers, all the rest of it, doing whatever they can. There's no point telling your victim that you're there, because all he's going to do, I'm sure he's probably already got a new phone now. So, and he's very, very aware that he's vulnerable, and he's started an inquiry. So, unlikely to have been the deep centre of the Russian state hacking. We think that the sort of St. Petersburg-based Internet Research Agency, the big troll farm up there, is responsible for a lot of this. This sounds more like that kind of stuff, and some of the gifted amateurs on the edges of the ecosystem, rather than a proper state attack from Russia.
Thanks, Dom. Before we move on to speaking to Ben about the sporting side of things, I wondered, as we head into the weekend, we do these podcasts on a weekday basis, what you think we could have ahead this weekend and what to keep an eye out for, both in terms of kind of military and tactics and maybe even this kind of cyber war that's going on at the same time.
Well, I think the military is going nowhere. I mean, certainly the Russian ground offensive is going nowhere. They are still bogged down. They are getting increasingly desperate. There's a flow of arms and equipment such as helmets, body armour, night vision, thermal cameras and what have you to Ukraine. All of that stuff is absolutely fundamental as well. We focus on the anti-tank missiles and anti-air missiles, but all the other stuff, simply down to the rounds of ammunition. I mean, this is absolutely critical to keep the fight going. So Russia is bogged down and is being slowly ground down by the Ukrainian resistance. They're responding, as we've seen, with aerial strikes, artillery strikes and what have you. So expect more of that. Keep an eye out on what comes out of China or what comes out of this talk this afternoon between Biden and Xi Jinping. That I think, and the body language or the language that's used and the messaging that comes out of that will be absolutely crucial. So I think that's the thing to watch out for this afternoon.
Since the invasion of Ukraine began, we've seen Russia frozen out of sporting arenas across the world. I'm joined by Ben Rumsby, our sports investigations reporter here at the Telegraph. I wondered if, to start, you could give us a sense of just how Russia has been frozen out of the sporting world in the last 3 weeks.
Yeah, so it's been pretty unprecedented, to be honest, in the sporting world. There have long been calls for Russia to be frozen out of sport for lots of different reasons, whether it be doping or other reasons. But the Ukraine crisis has really unified sport in a way that I've not seen before. And effectively, Russia are serving a sort of blanket ban from world sport in all but a very few
and
cases.
How have Russia responded to that? Have they launched a kind of legal action? Because I can't imagine that they're saying, okay, that's fine, we won't turn up.
Yeah, so Russia have launched an appeal in the sports courts, particularly against their ban from world football. So at the moment, they have been thrown out of the qualifying tournament for the World Cup, which takes place later this year. That appeal is still pending. They've lost in sort of an initial judgment that would put that sanction on hold, and we are waiting to hear whether that will sort of be a longer term issue. But they're not taking it lying down, as you would expect, and we would expect even more appeals to be lodged. You know, there's lots of sport out there and lots of athletes have been affected by this. And also there could be more to come. More athletes could find themselves excluded, the ones that are currently able to compete at the moment. As this crisis develops, there may be more sanctions imposed that prevent them from carrying out their business as well.
You mentioned sanctions there. Now, there is one big sanctions case that seems to be dominating the sporting discussion at the moment, and that is obviously the sanctions on Roman Abramovich, the Russian oligarch who has links to Vladimir Putin. Can you give us, our listeners who might not be so familiar with how the last few weeks have played out, a sense of, firstly, why Abramovich sanctions impact Chelsea, and then the current situation that Chelsea as a football club are in?
Yeah, so today is actually D-Day as far as Chelsea is concerned. It's the deadline for people wanting to buy the club to submit their bids. As you say, Chelsea are effectively under sanction themselves because of Roman Abramovich owning 100% of the club and all his assets having been frozen. They're being allowed to operate purely under a special license that lets them play matches but doesn't allow them to sort of generate revenue that might end up going back to their owner. This has been a long time coming. For weeks and longer in some cases, people have been calling for Roman Abramovich to be sanctioned over his links to Vladimir Putin. It's unclear why the government decided not to do that until now. Obviously, we're in a very different political climate than we were before. And in fairness, they were the first to act of the sort of major Western powers. And it would appear Abramovich foresaw this. He put the club up for sale before the sanctions were imposed, and even said that he would take not a penny of revenue out of it and would donate any money generated to the victims of this conflict. The government aren't going to let him do that. They are going to take the money, or make sure, I should say, that the money goes to maybe disaster relief funds of their choosing and not of his choosing. But it really is an extraordinary and unprecedented situation in English football.
And you say that Abramovich kind of reacted to the sanctions and has agreed, put Chelsea up for sale relatively quickly, but is there a sense that he also, because he saw this coming and there was that delay, that he had time to kind of put his assets out elsewhere and make a plan that was beneficial for him as well?
Yeah, certainly. This has bought him some time. He was photographed for the first time since he was sanctioned earlier this week, travelling seemingly from Moscow to Turkey via Israel. And also his super yacht, reputedly one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive super yacht in the world, was also being tracked heading to Turkey. And Turkey is outside of the EU, so the yacht, if it's there, cannot be seized currently. And I'm sure that a lot of assets that he is able to relocate out of territories in which he is sanctioned are currently have been so, if not already.
And this situation has been one that's certainly difficult for Chelsea fans as they face up to the kind of awful links that Abramovich has with the Russian president. Can you give a sense of what the current situation is for Chelsea fans? Can they still go to matches if they have season tickets? Can they still use them? Are they still valid?
Yeah, so the asset freeze applied from last Thursday. Seems like an age ago, but it is really only just over a week ago that this happened. So anybody in possession of a ticket, whether that be a match ticket or a season ticket before then, those are still valid. So for the rest of this season, Chelsea can at least play their home matches in a stadium that will be probably around 2/3 full. They are desperately trying to get the government to agree to allow more supporters to attend. Today was actually the draw for the quarterfinals of the Champions League, and listeners may know that Chelsea are the current holders. They won the competition last season. And because season tickets do not apply to Champions League matches, they are facing the prospect of playing the home leg of that tie behind closed doors. But as we reported yesterday in today's paper as well, the government is willing to entertain having fans there. What they aren't willing to entertain is that Chelsea will get the money from any tickets themselves. So a way will have to be found where fans can buy tickets, but the money is either given to charity or to the football authorities to distribute elsewhere, or some other mechanism that avoids Chelsea getting that revenue, because the government's been very clear that while Abramovich's assets are frozen, he cannot receive a penny. And
we spoke there about the Champions League. Now, the other huge tournament that's coming up later this year is obviously the World Cup. How, away from Chelsea, how could the kind of geopolitics impact that tournament going ahead?
Well, as I said earlier, the main impact at the moment is Russia's expulsion. They have been thrown out of the playoffs, which were taking place next week or the week after, I think. So they will need to be replaced in the competition. Also, the Women's European Championships are being held in England this summer. And Russia had already qualified for that tournament, and they've also been thrown out of that. Interestingly, one of the teams that could replace them is Ukraine, and what a story that would be if they ended up being selected. I think they're one of three teams there's going to be a draw to decide which of the three teams replaces Russia. And what a story it would be if Ukraine ended up being the team selected to replace them. And then, as you say, at the end of the year, you've got a World Cup in Qatar. Long been massive controversy about the location for that tournament. In fact, the previous tournament was in Russia itself. So you've really got two World Cups now in which there's been huge controversy. If this crisis, continues until the end of the year, and let's pray that it doesn't, but if it does, then I'm sure the World Cup will be used politically. You've got potentially, in a region where there has been not necessarily support for Russia, but certainly there have been nations in the Gulf who haven't exactly condemned what's going on there. It'll be very interesting to see whether there is a sort of, political heat, whether any teams will use the tournament to highlight what's going on in Ukraine. Football is becoming increasingly linked with political causes, whether it's Black Lives Matter or even the Qatar World Cup itself and human rights. It wouldn't surprise me at all if there were some pro-Ukraine or anti-Russian views expressed during the tournament.
Indeed, and with the kind of oil supply crisis, I mean, Qatar obviously shares borders with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, so you can imagine that these nations that are so entrenched in the crisis themselves are gonna kind of impact upon such a kind of global event, especially later this year. I wanted to turn quickly to the athletes on the other side who might not have been banned but have come out in support of Vladimir Putin. What are the high profile cases that we've seen so far, and how has the kind of national response played out, I guess, international response even?
Yeah, in terms of athletes, overtly supporting what's happened, high profile athletes anyway. Really the biggest one was at a gymnastics event last week or the week before, where one of the medalists from Russia, and he wasn't allowed to represent Russia officially. He was, a sort of neutral athlete, as a lot of these people now are. He wore a Z on his top, and that obviously caused a major outcry, and he's now facing major action from the sport as a result of that. The other, really high profile examples are the tennis players, who interestingly aren't really part of the ban that's been imposed. These guys are kind of seen as freelancers who don't sort of represent their country in any formal manner at the likes of Wimbledon and other major tennis tournaments. But certainly scrutiny is very much now turning on them. The one who's really spoken out and gone probably as far as anybody in terms of condemning what's happening is a female tennis player called Anastasia Pavlyuchenkova. I mean, she's even said that she's not scared to say what she thinks. You've got a male tennis player called Andrei Rublev, who wrote on the camera of the television camera after one of his matches, "No war, please." And then finally, there's the I don't know if he's still world number one. He may have lost that status actually now, but he certainly was world number one tennis player, Daniil Medvedev. I mean, he has called for peace, but he hasn't overtly condemned Putin or Russia's invasion as you or I might do. And we heard from the government just this week that they are potentially drawing up plans for Russian tennis players and other, freelance performers who may have to come out publicly and denounce what's happening in order to play at the likes of Wimbledon.
And if they do come out and denounce, surely, whilst lots of these athletes have been able to leave Russia, along with lots of the kind of young people that have left in the last 3 weeks, there are certainly athletes in Russia now who won't be able to leave and might feel forced into not condemning the war. What kind of risks are these athletes facing within the kind of Russian setup?
Well, I think we all know what Vladimir Putin is capable of in terms of how he deals with his enemies. I think anybody would understandably be afraid of speaking up overtly in this manner, particularly people in high-profile roles. I personally don't actually think they will be required to do that. I think legally and morally that's fraught with difficulties. But I do think anybody who comes out actively supporting what's happened, as I say, this gymnast did, they certainly would not be welcome at these events. I think that's probably where we will end up with this.
Yeah, and it seems like it's a kind of thing that, as long as this conflict goes on, will continue to go on as well as we have international sport. I guess that leads into probably my final question for you, Ben, which would be, how do you see this impacting the future of not just football, but kind of sport in general? We've had Olympics during World War II. We've had these kind of issues before, but do you see it changing Russia's status on the sporting stage for good?
Yeah, I mean, like pretty much every institution in the Western world, the last sort of decade or so, sport has spent cozying up to Russia, awarding its biggest events to Russia, Olympics, World Cups, and now you couldn't imagine holding an event in Russia, anytime soon. I mean, when do you welcome back into the fold a country, or certainly a country with a leader who has carried out an invasion of another sovereign country? I think I can't see how that will happen while Vladimir Putin remains Russian president. I think if were he to be toppled, were he to go, then certainly any new leader, if they were seen to be, not like him, you could see very quickly Russia being welcomed back, because it's a huge country, huge money involved, and sports, it's addicted to this kind of cash. But no, while Putin remains president, wouldn't surprise me at all if Russia remains something of a pariah state in sport, indefinitely.
I know I said that was my final question, but you've just sparked one more question from me, which would be, you said, Russia has a huge amount of money, and it funds a lot of sport. Do you think that has put some sports kind of at a risk of underfunding, and in the same way that we've seen financial sanctions have real impacts on Russian businesses? Do you think it will have the same kind of impacts on Russian sports, for example, and the funding we might see for an Olympic team or a football team?
Yeah, I've got no doubt, and the same actually potentially will apply to sports outside of Russia. I mean, we are all suffering the effects of this war in terms of costs of living, fuel prices, etc., etc. The same is bound to be reflected in the economy of sport as well, both inside and outside of Russia. You would like to think that the impact within Russia would be much, much greater, as you would with the economic sanctions that have been imposed elsewhere, because this may well turn into a situation of who can put up with the hardship for the longest. So absolutely, I'm sure that Russian funding for Russian sport will have an impact. There'll be an impact on that.
And I guess we should probably put a final thought towards the Ukrainian athletes. Now, there have been Ukrainian athletes competing over the last 2 weeks. I know we've seen kind of tennis players and stuff. Is there a sense that Ukrainian athletes will continue to compete? I know that many, even the Klitschko brothers, for example, are on the battlefield. How do you think it will change sport in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, that's really one of the main justifications for what's happened to Russia in the sporting landscape. Some people might say, oh, why do you punish people who have nothing to do with the war? Well, the same is happening to Ukraine sports people as a result of this invasion. Their ability to perform, particularly within the country, has been destroyed by this. So if they're suffering, why shouldn't the athletes from the antagonistic country be suffering as well? Some sports people have been evacuated from the country. Others, want to sort of fight for their homeland. You mentioned the Klitschkos, probably the most famous individuals in Ukraine, let alone sports people. It's extremely difficult. The Ukraine football team was meant to be playing Scotland in the World Cup playoffs, and that match has had to be postponed because they're unable to play for their clubs to prepare for this game. They may well have faced difficulty getting out of Ukraine for this game. So it's horrendous on all fronts, really.
To stay on top of all our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio, or sign up to Dispatches, our daily Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you found this show helpful, follow Ukraine, the latest, on your podcast app, and if there's something we could do to make it even more useful, do let us know. You can email podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and on Twitter, Alice Hearing.